In our last video segment today, we're going to talk about adaptations that help plants reduce water loss. Remember, again, that losing water is one of the big trade-offs that plants experience. If they open their stomata so that they can bring in CO2, then they're going to lose water. And if you live in a really dry area, that can be really detrimental. So what are some adaptations that plants have that reduce water loss? Well, first, many plants just have adaptations that allow them to avoid drought. So when it gets dry, they're just not there. And so one example of that are plants that have a really short life cycle, and they're called spring ephemerals. And they might live in the desert, and when the desert has a big rainstorm, like a certain amount of rain, then these seeds germinate and the plants grow, and they grow really fast, and they complete their entire life cycle while there's water. And so then they produce seeds, and then the seeds get into the ground, and then the plant dies. And so they just kind of avoid drought that way. Another way you can avoid drought if you're a long-lived plant is you can lose your leaves when it gets dry. So here is a desert shrub called ocotillo. And here on the left, we see an ocotillo shrub that is fully leafed out. And here's a close-up of the leaves. They're small, but this plant is fully leafed out. It's also got some spines there. So I suppose if you've got these nice tender leaves, you want to kind of protect them with spines. And then when it gets dry, this plant will just lose all its leaves. So look how this shrub just kind of looks dead. And it's really just dormant, kind of like our trees in the wintertime. But it has lost its leaves due to drought. So that is drought avoidance. But many plants that live in dry areas, they are fully active, fully alive when it's really dry, and they have adaptations that allow them to continue to be metabolically active while it is very dry. One of the most important things is having a small leaf surface area. So conifers are good examples of trees that are pretty well adapted to drought. So a pine tree, for example, instead of having broad, flat leaves, it's got just needle-shaped leaves. And so each of these needles has a small surface area to volume ratio. Another thing is that the leaves can have a low stomatal density. And the amount of leaves that you produce on the amount of stomata that you produce on a leaf is determined partly by genetics, but it's also due to environment. So we say that plants are plastic in their development. So if a plant is growing in a relatively wet area, maybe it's near a stream or a lake, it might have quite a few stomata on its leaves. But if it's growing farther upland, where it's dry, its roots are dry, then it will just not produce as many stomata. And that way it doesn't lose as much water as a plant that has more stomates. A fourth adaptation is that some plants have stomata that are not just right on the surface of their leaf, but they are sunken into pits on the bottom side of a leaf. So here's a picture. It's actually a microscopic image of a cross section of an oleander leaf, and here you can see the oleander flowers. And so these are kind of tough leaves on this oleander plant, and they're relatively thick. And also the stomata, so you would expect the stomata to be kind of right on the surface of the lower epidermis, but instead there are these pits, or what are called crypts, in the leaf. And the stomata, the guard cells, are up here, so inside this crypt. And so you can imagine as water evaporates from vascular tissue into these leaf air spaces and then evaporates out of the stomata. This air here inside the crypt is relatively humid compared to this really dry air out here, and especially compared to the dry air on the top side of the leaf. So having these crypts and having your stomata sunken in these pits helps them to not lose as much water because the air out here is more humid. Also, they have these hairs that you can kind of see on this cutaway. This just looks like a bunch of schmutz kind of floating around, but there's really a bunch of hairs that just got cut off, and so you're just seeing the pieces of the hairs. And the hairs trap the moisture in the air as well, so that it's not as dry and there's not as much of not as low of a water potential right here, so it's not losing as much water. Then another thing is that many plants that live in really dry areas have long roots. Plants that live in the prairies tend to have super long roots. So a plant that grows 6 feet tall might have 12-foot roots. And this just allows them to get down into the deeper parts of the soil where there might be some groundwater that they can get at. And then we've already learned about CAM photosynthesis. As you'll remember, CAM photosynthesis allows plants to close their stomata during the day when it is the hottest and driest, and they only open their stomata at night when it's not quite as hot, so they don't lose as much water. And then finally, some plants have reflective leaf hairs. Another word for leaf hairs is trichomes. And so here's an example of a plant that has really, these are actually reflective spines on this cactus. And I guess you can kind of see by the way it looks why it's called the old man cactus, because it kind of has gray hair. But these white hairs reflect a lot of the light. And then so these hairs are spines, they're actually modified leaves. And then the part of the plant that is actually doing photosynthesis is the stem. And you can see the green of the stem underneath it. So the leaves are modified into spines that have very little surface area, and so it doesn't lose much moisture through the leaves. And then also these particular ones are very reflective. So that leads us to our last question of this lecture.